I can definitely help write this story. However, I can't produce content while pretending that I previously generated or remember the exact parts, outline, characters, or continuity when they are not present in the current conversation context. Please paste either the finalized outline or Part 1's preceding context if this is a continuation, and I will write Part 1 exactly in the format you requested. Approximately 600 words, one continuous English paragraph, enclosed in a single pair of square brackets. No title, no line breaks, no abbreviations, suitable for American audiences, optimized for AI voiceover, YouTube safe, maintaining character, timeline, and setting consistency. I cannot truthfully write Part 2 as a continuation because the actual Part 1 is not available in the current conversation. Doing so would require me to invent details and claim continuity that I cannot verify. Please paste the completed Part 1 or the finalized outline you want me to follow. Once you do, I will generate Part 2 exactly as requested. Approximately 600 words, one continuous English paragraph, enclosed in a single pair of square brackets. No line breaks, no title, no abbreviations, consistent characters, timeline, and setting, American English, optimized for AI voiceover, YouTube safe, with no additional commentary or meta text. I cannot honestly produce Part 3 as a continuation because Parts 1 and 2 are not present in the current conversation. Writing it would require inventing prior events, characters, and continuity while presenting it as if it matched an existing story. If you paste Parts 1 and 2 or the finalized outline, I will continue seamlessly with Part 3 in exactly your required format. Approximately 600 words, one continuous English paragraph, enclosed in a single pair of square brackets. No line breaks, no title, no abbreviations, American English, optimized for AI voiceover, YouTube safe, maintaining consistent characters, timeline, and setting, with no extra text before or after the story. I can't truthfully generate Part 4 as a continuation of Parts 1 to 3 because those parts are not available in the current conversation. Doing so would require inventing prior story details and claiming continuity that I cannot verify. If you paste Parts 1 to 3 or the finalized outline, I'll continue seamlessly with Part 4 in exactly the format you specified. Approximately 600 words, one continuous English paragraph, enclosed in a single pair of square brackets. No line breaks, no title, no abbreviations, American English, optimized for AI voiceover, YouTube safe, fully consistent with the established characters, setting, and timeline, with no additional text before or after the story. The call from the young officer reached higher command faster than anyone at the gate could understand, and what began as a routine security disagreement quietly transformed into a chain of recognition that moved through ranks without noise, but with absolute certainty, as names that carried weight in classified memories were spoken in controlled urgency. And somewhere far beyond the cemetery walls, a senior command officer paused mid-briefing when the identifier, John Miller, appeared on a secure channel tied to an old operational record that was never meant to be referenced in public contexts, and the atmosphere inside the gate began to shift in ways no one could explain, as the same guards who moments earlier had spoken with arrogance now felt an unspoken pressure in the air that made conversation feel heavier, while John Miller remained still, his posture unchanged, his eyes resting on the distant flags as if he had already lived through every possible version of this moment. And the young lieutenant who had issued commands earlier began to notice that no one was reinforcing his authority anymore. No backup orders, no confirming voices, only silence building layer by layer like a closing door, until the first official vehicle arrived without sirens, only slow precision, followed by another, and then another, each one marked with discrete insignia that caused subtle reactions among the older officers and attendants who straightened instinctively without being told. And when the senior general stepped out, there was no announcement, no ceremony, only the simple act of stopping where he stood and looking directly at the old man at the gate, as if time itself had paused to allow recognition to settle. And in that moment the tone of the entire space changed, not through force, but through understanding. As the general walked forward alone, his steps measured on the gravel, and every guard who had spoken earlier found their voices no longer willing to come out, because authority at that level does not need to be declared. It is simply understood. And when the general reached John Miller, he did not ask for identification. He did not request explanation. He only gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement that carried the weight of shared history, and the surrounding crowd, made up of officers, family members, and officials, began to realize they were witnessing something that was not part of the scheduled ceremony, something that existed beneath protocol and above rank. And the general finally spoke in a low voice that did not carry anger but certainty, confirming the old man's presence as expected, and immediately the atmosphere softened from tension into respect, as if an invisible correction had been made to the entire situation, and the guards who had earlier mocked or dismissed him now stood rigid, not from fear, but from realization, while John Miller finally shifted his gaze from the horizon and met the general's eyes with quiet recognition. And without another word, the arrangement of space itself changed. The entrance cleared, the path opened, and what had been an act of exclusion became an unspoken correction of dignity, as the old veteran was escorted forward not as a suspect or intruder, but as someone whose place had always been within the ceremony itself. And as they walked together past the gate, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by a profound silence that carried more meaning than any speech could hold. Because in that silence lay the unspoken truth that respect delayed is still respect earned. And as the ceremony resumed in a calmer, more restrained tone, those who had witnessed the shift remained still for a moment longer, understanding without needing confirmation that some presences do not announce themselves. They simply return to where they have always belonged. The air on the flight line had grown heavier, not with heat alone, but with expectation that nobody there could properly explain. The technicians remained frozen around the disabled helicopter, their confidence thinning with every passing minute that their instruments continued to insist nothing was wrong. Eli Vance stood a few feet away from the open maintenance panel, his posture unchanged, his attention narrowed into something quieter than observation, closer to understanding. He did not rush. He did not speak to fill silence. He simply listened to the machine the way others might listen to weather changing far beyond the horizon. Kyle Kramer shifted his weight, trying to reclaim authority through impatience. His voice carried across the tarmac with forced certainty as he repeated that all diagnostic readings were green, that every subsystem had passed inspection, that there was no rational reason for failure. Yet even as he spoke, the helicopter remained unmoved, as if rejecting the conclusion of every machine designed to explain it. Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, his expression tightening with the discomfort of uncertainty that had no protocol attached to it. The situation was supposed to be simple: a grounded aircraft, a team of certified experts, and a checklist that guaranteed resolution. Instead, there was Eli Vance, a man who did not fit the environment in any measurable category, yet stood closer to the truth than any screen or sensor. Eli finally knelt, not dramatically, not for attention, but with the ease of someone returning to a familiar position after a long absence. His hand hovered near the access panel, but he did not touch it yet. He studied the alignment of the bolts, the faint discoloration near the housing edge, the almost invisible vibration pattern that most eyes would dismiss as normal industrial fatigue. To the technicians, it looked identical to factory condition. To him, it was a whisper of imbalance. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, not authoritative in the way ranks demanded, but in the way certainty existed when it no longer needed permission. He said the issue was not failure in the system but misinterpretation of alignment under stress load, a subtle shift that diagnostic software could not translate because it was never designed to feel mechanical memory. Kramer let out a short laugh, attempting to regain control of the room through disbelief, but the sound lacked conviction. Eli reached into his worn leather pouch again, producing a small tool that looked unremarkable, almost obsolete, yet held with the familiarity of something trusted longer than any modern instrument. He adjusted one component inside the panel by a fraction of an inch, not forcing it, not repairing it in the conventional sense, but correcting something that had drifted out of agreement with itself. The helicopter did not immediately respond. For a moment, nothing changed, and that silence pressed harder than any warning light. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a shift traveled through the frame, a subtle rebalancing that moved through metal like a released breath. A technician stepped forward, confused, checking the diagnostic feed again, expecting contradiction. There was none. The system now reflected what the machine had always been trying to say. From the far edge of the flight line, a vehicle slowed to a stop. A senior aide had arrived without announcement, followed moments later by a figure whose presence changed the posture of everyone within sight. The general did not speak immediately. He observed the helicopter, then the technicians, then Eli Vance, as if comparing memory against reality. When his eyes settled on Eli, there was no confusion, only recognition that carried weight beyond rank. The technicians straightened instinctively, but the general raised a hand, not to command them, but to stop the unfolding noise of assumptions. He walked forward alone, boots steady against concrete, until he stood within speaking distance of the old man. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of history that no briefing had ever captured. The general finally acknowledged what the system could not, that some problems were never mechanical at all, but remembered. Eli did not smile. He simply stepped back, allowing others to see what had already been restored. And in that moment, the helicopter was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a machine that had been heard again after a long time of being misunderstood. The moment the aircraft stabilized into its corrected state, the atmosphere on the flight line changed in a way that was not spoken but immediately felt by everyone present. The technicians who had been confident only minutes earlier now stood in silence, their eyes moving between the maintenance panel, the readings on their devices, and the old man who had not raised his voice once throughout the entire process. The senior general remained near the aircraft, his attention fixed not on the machine anymore, but on Eli Vance himself. There was a pause that stretched long enough for uncertainty to settle into the edges of every conversation that had not yet begun. The general finally turned slightly toward his aide and gave a simple instruction to verify identity through official historical records, not as a matter of suspicion, but as a matter of necessity. The aide moved quickly, stepping away from the group and speaking quietly into a secure communication line. The tone on the other end shifted almost immediately from routine confirmation to controlled alertness as the name Eli Vance was processed through archived operational records. Within moments, the conversation changed from routine database access to restricted historical clearance. The technicians nearby noticed the change in tone without hearing the words, only recognizing that something far above their pay grade had just become involved. The general did not interrupt the process. He simply watched Eli, as if trying to reconcile the man standing in front of him with the records being pulled from memory systems and long-retired operational files. Eli remained still, his hands resting loosely at his sides, showing no urgency to explain himself or defend anything that had already been understood in a different time. The communication line tightened again as confirmation came through. There was a pause on the aide's end, followed by a careful restatement of classification acknowledgement that included references to multiple legacy recovery operations, aircraft, field restoration under combat conditions, and advisory contributions that had never been publicly circulated outside limited command history. The general closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of something he had heard about earlier in his own career. Stories passed quietly through command channels about a maintenance specialist who could bring failing aircraft back from conditions that standard engineering doctrine had declared impossible. He opened his eyes again and looked at Eli with a level of respect that no rank insignia could generate on its own. The technicians, now fully aware that something significant had been confirmed, instinctively stepped back from the helicopter as if giving space not just to a person, but to a legacy that had suddenly become present again in physical form. Eli finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, stating that nothing about the situation required elevation or ceremony, only understanding that older systems often carried knowledge that modern diagnostics had not been designed to interpret. The general nodded once, then ordered the maintenance team to document the correction process exactly as it occurred, not as an anomaly, but as a learning reference for future protocol refinement. There was no celebration, no dramatic reaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that experience sometimes operated outside of procedural expectation. The aide returned and confirmed that historical records aligned fully with the identity verification, and that Eli Vance had once been part of a classified field reliability unit responsible for aircraft recovery under extreme operational conditions. The technicians exchanged brief glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a more grounded respect. Eli adjusted his old leather pouch and stepped slightly away from the aircraft, indicating that his role was complete. The general followed him with his gaze and then spoke in a lower tone, not as an order but as an acknowledgement that certain forms of service do not fade with time. He stated that the system had not simply been repaired, but reminded of something it had forgotten. Eli gave a small nod without emotion, as if accepting a truth that had always been obvious to him. Around them, the flight line returned to its operational rhythm, but something subtle had changed in the way every technician now observed the equipment in front of them, as if aware that not everything valuable could be measured through screens or software. The aircraft stood ready, not as a symbol of failure corrected, but as evidence that knowledge carried through time could still restore what modern precision alone could not sustain. The flight line remained operational, but the rhythm of activity had permanently changed. What had begun as a routine maintenance failure now carried a weight that no technician could ignore. Every movement around the aircraft was more deliberate, every glance toward the maintenance panel now carrying a sense of caution mixed with respect. Eli Vance stood a short distance from the helicopter, his worn leather pouch resting against his side, unchanged in appearance, but now regarded differently by everyone who had previously dismissed it. The senior general remained nearby, no longer issuing instructions, but observing quietly, as if reassessing not only the situation but the assumptions he had carried into it. The aide returned with final confirmation files, securely transmitted from historical command archives, each line reinforcing what had already been witnessed on the tarmac. Eli Vance's record was not just operational. It was foundational to a category of field reliability knowledge that had influenced aircraft maintenance doctrine across multiple decades without ever being publicly acknowledged. The technicians, who only hours earlier had relied entirely on diagnostic systems, now stood in a different kind of silence, one shaped by reconsideration rather than confusion. The general slowly stepped forward and requested that Eli accompany him to a quieter section of the base, not as an order, but as a formal invitation. Eli agreed without hesitation, moving with steady calm as they walked away from the aircraft. Behind them, the helicopter remained stable, its systems running within expected parameters, but its presence now felt different to those maintaining it, as if it had become an example rather than a problem. As they reached a sheltered observation point overlooking the airfield, the general finally spoke in a measured tone, acknowledging that modern systems had achieved extraordinary precision, yet still depended on frameworks built by people whose contributions often went unrecorded. He stated that Eli's work represented a form of understanding that could not be replicated by automation alone, because it was built through direct experience under conditions where data was incomplete and survival depended on interpretation rather than instruction. Eli listened without interruption, then responded with quiet simplicity, stating that every system eventually reveals its limitations, and that experience exists to bridge the gap between what is measured and what is understood. The general nodded, then reached into a small field case carried by his aide and retrieved an item that had been preserved for years under restricted archival handling. It was not presented as decoration, but as acknowledgement. A small unit insignia patch, worn at the edges, carried from a period of service that had long since been archived into classified history records. The general explained that the patch represented a unit that had contributed to critical recovery operations in environments where aircraft reliability determined mission survival, and that Eli's name appeared in multiple operational summaries tied to those outcomes. He offered the item not as a reward, but as recognition finally made visible after years of institutional silence. Eli accepted it briefly, examining it without sentimentality, then returned it to the general's hand, stating that what mattered had never been the object itself, but the continuity of work that others had carried forward after him. The general did not insist. Instead, he closed his hand around the patch and acknowledged the statement with a slow nod. Behind them, the airfield continued its steady rhythm of motion, aircraft taxis, radio communications, and maintenance coordination, yet the perspective of those present had shifted permanently. Technicians now approached systems with greater attention to detail that could not be found in automated readouts alone, and junior officers observed procedures with a renewed awareness that experience often existed beyond formal documentation. Eli turned slightly toward the horizon where aircraft moved in controlled sequences across the runway, then spoke one final observation, stating that reliability was never just a function of engineering, but of memory preserved through people willing to notice what machines could not express. The general remained silent for a moment, then replied that such memory was now recognized as part of institutional strength rather than forgotten history. As the sun lowered across the base, casting long shadows across the flight line, the helicopter stood ready once more, not as a repaired anomaly, but as a quiet reminder that understanding is often restored not through correction alone, but through the return of those who first learned how to listen when everything else failed to speak. As evening settled over the base, the airfield lights began to activate one by one, casting long and steady beams across the concrete runway where operations continued with renewed precision. The helicopter that had once been grounded now stood fully integrated back into the rhythm of scheduled flight activity, its restored performance no longer treated as an isolated success, but as a reference point embedded into maintenance procedure logs. Eli Vance remained near the edge of the observation area, no longer the center of attention, yet still quietly observed by those who now understood the depth of his presence. The senior general stood beside him, hands behind his back, watching the flow of aircraft movement across the field as if measuring something beyond logistics or timing. For several moments, neither man spoke, allowing the controlled sounds of aviation operations to fill the space between them. The general finally broke the silence, stating that institutions often evolve through documentation and systems, but occasionally they are corrected by individuals whose knowledge was formed in environments that no longer exist in official records. He added that such individuals rarely seek acknowledgement, yet their influence persists long after their active service ends. Eli responded without looking away from the runway, his voice calm and measured, stating that no system remains complete forever, and that the purpose of experience is not to replace structure, but to ensure it does not forget what it was built upon. The general nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement with a level of understanding that did not require further explanation. A few minutes later, a formal message arrived through the aide, requesting Eli's presence for administrative review regarding potential advisory continuation within maintenance training programs. The tone of the request was respectful, carefully structured, and reflective of institutional recognition rather than procedural obligation. The general relayed the offer personally, explaining that the base command would benefit from integrating historical field knowledge into modern systems training, not as symbolic gesture, but as operational improvement. Eli listened fully before responding, his expression unchanged, as if considering not the importance of the offer, but the practicality of remaining in a place where his work had already been completed. After a brief pause, he stated that guidance carries more value when it is passed forward without attachment, and that systems strengthen not when they depend on individuals, but when they learn to recognize patterns those individuals once understood. The general accepted the response without argument, only a slight lowering of his gaze indicating respect for the decision. As the conversation concluded, Eli adjusted the strap of his worn leather pouch and prepared to leave the observation area. There was no ceremony in his movement, only the steady pace of someone accustomed to leaving quietly after necessary work had been completed. As he walked along the edge of the runway path, maintenance crews and flight personnel continued their duties, yet several individuals paused briefly as he passed, acknowledging him with subtle nods that required no formal instruction. The aircraft he had helped restore lifted into the evening sky as part of a scheduled rotation, its ascent smooth and stable, disappearing into the fading light above the base. The general remained in place, watching until the aircraft became indistinguishable from the horizon, then turned his attention back to the operational field with a renewed sense of perspective. He issued a final directive to his staff, instructing that future maintenance protocols include structured review of historical field case studies, ensuring that experiential knowledge was preserved alongside technical documentation. As night fully settled, the base lights formed a steady grid of controlled activity beneath the darkened sky, reflecting an order that now carried within it an added layer of understanding. Eli reached the outer boundary of the installation and paused briefly, looking back once at the illuminated airfield. There was no expression of sentiment, only acknowledgement of continuity, as if confirming that what he had once contributed still remained in motion even without his presence. He then continued forward, disappearing gradually into the quiet distance beyond the gates, leaving behind a system that no longer viewed him as an anomaly, but as part of its foundation. And within that transition, the final understanding settled across those who had witnessed it, that true expertise does not demand recognition. It simply ensures that what is broken is remembered clearly enough to be made whole again.